Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. 911, what's your emergency? Static, then silence, and a heartbeat that would stop forever by 9:28 a.m. In the middle of a quiet Georgia campus, a student vanishes mid-run. No screams, no witnesses, just a cold body found by the lake, and a case that would fracture not only a university town, but the country itself. The morning of February 22, 2024 began without alarm. Weather conditions over Athens, Georgia were clear. No signs of disruption across the University of Georgia campus. No reports of student incidents, no campus-wide alerts, and no reason for any parent to worry, until Laken Riley didn't answer her texts. Riley, 22, was a nursing student enrolled at Augusta University's satellite program based in Athens. Known for her discipline, her routines were sharp, nearly mechanical. Wake up at 6 o'clock, coffee, stretch, run, shower, then class. Her roommate of 3 years confirmed that Riley never deviated from her schedule, not even during finals or flu season. At 9:03 a.m., Laken texted her mother a photo of the trailhead near Oconee Forest Park. There was no caption, just a shoe selfie over gravel and leaves. It was a routine check-in, harmless, but it would be the last trace of her alive. She never returned. By 11:45 a.m., her roommate, concerned, attempted contact. The calls went to voicemail. Messages marked as delivered sat unread. At 12:09 p.m., she filed a missing person report through UGA's online system. At 12:22, campus police began a trace. They found her smartwatch location still pinging, motionless, near Lake Herrick. At 12:38 p.m., law enforcement recovered her body, half concealed beneath underbrush, 48 feet from the trail edge, head trauma visible, body positioned face down, no signs of sexual assault or robbery, no purse, no obvious motive. But one detail was indisputable. Laken Riley was dead. The body was found by a UGA patrol officer responding to the GPS ping. Initial field notes described obvious blunt force trauma to the skull and abrasions along both forearms consistent with defensive posture. Mud caked the backs of her legs, not the soles of her shoes. Her smartwatch, still operational, recorded elevated heart rate spikes between 9:11 and 9:27 a.m., followed by a sudden cessation of data at exactly 9:28 a.m. There was no sign of a prolonged struggle, no weapons at the scene, no immediate DNA matches from state or federal databases. But one unsettling truth stood out to first responders. She had tried to call for help. A broken call log showed an incomplete outbound attempt to 911 at 9:12 a.m. The call lasted only 3 seconds before disconnecting. No audio was recovered, just dead air. At first, the university didn't issue a public statement. Athens Clark County Police worked jointly with UGA PD to cordon off the trailhead and begin canvassing. By late afternoon, word spread rapidly among students via social media. Rumors of an assault, a body, a failed emergency response. Campus morale fractured within hours. Detectives from ACCPD's Homicide and Major Crimes Unit took lead. Lieutenant Harris Moore was placed as case supervisor. His first note from the scene report stated, "This wasn't a robbery. Her AirPods were still in. No signs of a chase. Whoever did this had seconds and took them." From a forensics standpoint, 3 immediate anomalies presented themselves. No forced drag marks. The victim had been moved, but not far. The underbrush remained largely undisturbed, indicating the suspect either knew the terrain well or selected the location in advance. Lack of foreign footprints, rain from the previous night softened soil, yet no full third-party prints were identifiable beyond a partial tread near her calf. Unusual skin abrasion. On her left palm, a streak consistent with latex residue suggested contact with gloved hands. Forensic specialists began collecting trace evidence. Swabs, soil samples, hair fibers, pollen analysis, anything that could establish a timeline, a presence, or an identity. At 4:03 p.m., her parents were notified in person by sheriff deputies in Woodstock, Georgia. Her mother reportedly collapsed upon hearing the name, Lake Herrick. What came next would unfold faster than even seasoned investigators expected. UGA security logs confirmed no emergency alert was triggered. Camera coverage along the trail was non-existent. Campus-wide surveillance existed primarily around buildings, not the forest perimeter. But one key witness stepped forward. A student employee who monitored IT traffic noticed a login attempt to Riley's university account from an off-campus IP address, one she had never used. The timestamp? 10:47 a.m., over an hour after her recorded time of death. The laptop never left her dorm. That single login attempt would become the first digital footprint that cracked open what seemed, at first, to be an opportunistic act of violence. At the medical examiner's office, the preliminary autopsy confirmed extensive cranial trauma, cause of death, blunt force injury to the left temporal region with subarachnoid hemorrhage, defensive wounds on both wrists and forearms. Bruising along the neck suggested postmortem pressure, possibly to silence involuntary muscle spasms or respiratory noise. No evidence of sexual assault. No narcotics in the system. Toxicology negative. Time of death was confirmed between 9:26 and 9:29 a.m. based on cardiac data synced from the smartwatch. The ME noted the unusual pattern of deep, isolated strikes. Deliberate, not panicked. Whoever attacked her knew how to inflict fast, fatal damage. The first chapter of this case closed with a press briefing at 5:42 p.m. that evening. Chief of UGA Police stated the death was being investigated as a homicide. No suspects, no threat to the campus community. But not everyone agreed with that assessment. Detective Moore, in his private memo to investigators, wrote, "The location was intentional. This wasn't random. The way the scene was left and too clean, no signs of hesitation. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem." In murder investigations, most forensic breakthroughs don't come from dramatic DNA matches or hidden cameras. They come from trash. Something left behind. Something missed. In this case, it was a black hefty bag, half-slit and leaking something faintly red beneath the aluminum dumpster behind Building C of the campus housing complex. The location? Approximately 0.7 miles from where Lake and Riley's body was recovered. It was a janitor, not law enforcement, who noticed the bag around 5:22 p.m. on February 22, 2024. His report was short. Ripped bag, smelled weird, saw clothing, told my supervisor. He didn't open it, he didn't touch it, but what he saw was enough for campus security to call Athens Clarke County PD. Officers arrived within 7 minutes. The area was secured. Crime scene unit tagged it as Evidence Bag 2024 UGA 0187. Inside the bag were 3 items of forensic value. A pair of dark blue jogger pants with visible dirt and blood staining around the ankle hem. A 1 latex glove turned inside out, a hoodie, black, Champion brand, size medium, with a small rip along the right cuff and what appeared to be leaf fragments stuck in the inside lining. The entire contents were preserved, sealed, and transferred to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, crime lab that evening. Analysts fast-tracked the request. The hoodie became the primary item of interest. By 3:40 a.m., on February 23rd, preliminary tests confirmed the presence of human blood on the cuff interior, consistent with the B-positive blood type, matching Lake and Riley's medical records on file. Trace plant material inside the hoodie lining included Oconee forest moss, a species found only in shaded wooded areas near Lake Herrick. Forensic team lead, Dr. Vanessa Bright, included a field note. Blood pattern suggests contact transfer, not spatter. Consistent with pressure-based contact during struggle or restraint. This indicated the garment hadn't simply brushed against the victim post-mortem. It had likely been worn during the attack. There was also a fiber anomaly. Microscopic inspection revealed blonde hair strands, approximately 2 inches in length, embedded in the cuff fabric. The root structure of the strands, forcibly detached, not naturally shed, further supported the theory of close contact violence. Additionally, fragments of a vinyl-like adhesive were found on the jogger pants, possibly from a sticker, ID tag, or retail tag. This detail seemed minor, but it triggered a broader evidence sweep of nearby residence dumpsters, which uncovered several torn barcode labels matching clothing purchased from a local Goodwill store just 72 hours prior. Investigators began canvassing Goodwill's security footage. Meanwhile, campus IT analysts reviewed access logs from the surrounding dorm buildings. Though the attacker had not used a university ID swipe to enter any facility, an unsecured maintenance entrance to Building C had been left ajar for 2 hours that morning. A time-stamped camera from an adjacent parking structure, angled and grainy, showed a male figure walking toward that alley at 10:02 a.m., carrying what appeared to be a drawstring bag. The face was obscured, clothing was nondescript, but the gait was unique. A slight left leg drag, possibly an old injury or muscular imbalance. This detail would later prove critical. Detective Latif Harris Moore, who had by now taken full lead on the case, logged a field comment after viewing the footage. Not accidental. Whoever dropped that bag knew Building C had a blind spot. That's experience, not panic. The search radius expanded to include all dormitories within a 1-mile radius, with special attention to temporary residents, maintenance contractors, and non-students occupying shared spaces. On February 23rd at 8:15 a.m., forensic analysts completed DNA swabbing on all 3 clothing items. The inner cuff of the hoodie produced a partial male DNA profile. The latex glove carried both a partial male profile and a secondary female epithelial trace, low level but consistent with contact skin cell transfer. The data was uploaded to CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, under the GBI's Homicide Protocol Tier 1. There was no immediate match. However, a low-confidence hit flagged from an out-of-state arrest, an unresolved incident in New York City involving trespassing and public indecency from 2023. The subject had been fingerprinted but not detained due to lack of ICE cooperation. That subject's name was redacted during the initial flag, pending formal match confirmation. The lead investigator's internal reaction wasn't logged officially, but in a direct message to GBI Forensic Liaison, Moore typed, "If this turns out to be him, I want every arrest report and I want it yesterday. We should have known." Back at the scene, technicians revisited the dump site. Drainage patterns under the dumpster confirmed liquid runoff matching human hemoglobin properties. Soil samples indicated time of placement between 10:15 and 11:00 a.m., the day of the murder, post-crime but before media or law enforcement arrived on scene. This further established that the suspect stayed nearby after the attack, long enough to hide evidence, possibly long enough to try and cover his tracks further. And that's what concerned Moore most. By February 24th, pressure mounted. Public outcry intensified on social media. Demands for answers, safety briefings, emergency meetings, news crews positioned outside campus gates. The university issued a statement confirming the homicide and pledged full cooperation, but behind closed doors, task force agents were now working 20-hour days, zeroing in on whoever had left that bag and why the traces inside pointed toward someone who never should have been on campus to begin with. It wasn't the forest trail, it wasn't the blood, it was a login. February 22nd, 2024, 10:47 a.m. Over an hour after Laken Riley's heart stopped, her university account was accessed from an external IP address linked to a private network outside campus. The access wasn't flagged immediately because technically nothing about it broke policy. But for a digital forensics analyst at UGA's IT security team, who had been instructed to preserve all data traces from the hours following the homicide, it didn't sit right. The analyst documented the event. Login, lriley42.augusta.edu. Time, 10:47 a.m. EST device, unrecognized. Location, Athens, but not from campus Wi-Fi. Activity, access to student portal, 1-minute duration. Logout, manual, not timed out. At that time, Laken's body was already dead in the woods. Her smartwatch had stopped transmitting by 9:28. Her phone had been found 48 feet from the body at 12:20. There was no rational explanation for how she, or anyone authorized, could have accessed her profile. And there was something else. The session had attempted to access a document titled Clinical Practicum Hours, Spring Rotation, a private PDF stored in her cloud drive used only for clinical log submissions. It had been opened, then immediately closed. To investigators, this wasn't just a mistake. It was curiosity, or control. Detectives moved fast. The IP was traced to a prepaid mobile hotspot, a burner connection purchased in cash from a convenience store off West Broad Street. The store had exterior cameras. On February 19th, 3 days before the murder, footage captured a man at the register buying a TracFone mobile hotspot and a $30 data card. Baseball cap, surgical mask, black hoodie. No conversation. He paid in fives and walked out. Though the image was grainy, the leg drag was noticeable. Same left side lean seen in the alley camera near the dumpster from Chapter 2. The track phone number had only connected once, for the 10:47 a.m. login. It had not been used again. This confirmed the access was deliberate, single-use, and possibly a post-crime revisit for information. That specificity led investigators to reconsider a possibility that had, until then, remained secondary. The attacker may have known Lakin, not intimately, but enough to want to confirm what she was working on, or perhaps what she might have left behind. Latte. Harris Moore recorded this in his case journal. This wasn't to erase data. This was to check. You don't check unless you're worried what someone else will find. A wider sweep of digital records revealed one more anomaly. A failed password reset request had been sent to Lakin's account 2 days before her death, originating from the same IP range, but never completed. That attempt had not been logged as suspicious, as it didn't match the university's definition of a breach. Now, it was added to the evidence timeline. To clarify, Feb 20, unsuccessful password reset attempt. Feb 22, 9:28 a.m. Estimated time of death. Feb 22, 10:47 a.m. Account login from burner device. Together, these timestamps formed a pattern. Someone had attempted to gain access to Lakin's account days before, then returned post-mortem to complete the task. The behavior was calculated, not impulsive. This discovery also shifted the tone of the investigation internally. Until now, the assumption leaned toward a crime of opportunity, sudden, random, fast. But the digital trail disrupted that theory. Whoever committed this act stayed close enough to access a hotspot connected to a single-use device and attempted digital access more than once. The GBI's digital forensics unit took over full traceback protocol. They scrubbed known Wi-Fi networks within a 2-mile radius, identifying 13 possible residential devices matching the router signature used. It was a process of elimination, but one that narrowed the suspect pool considerably. At the same time, the team requested metadata from Google to track any voice command activity associated with devices near the forest at the time of the murder. While no hits came from Smart Assistants, a single keyword search, how to delete device history from Garmin, was entered into a public library terminal 24 hours after Lakin's death. No ID was used to log into the session. Surveillance footage from the library was archived. Review was pending. The significance of this chapter isn't in what was seen, but what was done after the body was left behind. The account login, while technically minor, suggested the kind of behavioral footprint law enforcement relies on in post-crime analysis. Movement without motive is noise. But movement with intention, especially when it risks exposure, is signal. To the team, it wasn't just about accessing data, it was about proximity. Whoever did this wasn't running. There's something about evidence pulled from the ground. It doesn't lie, it doesn't withhold emotion, it just holds what it was forced to carry. As crime scene technicians revisited the woods near Lake Herrick, they weren't searching for another body. They were looking for particles, soil, fragments, fibers. The kind of trace most people overlook, but in forensic work, even a partial footprint or a single embedded hair can redirect an entire case file. That's what happened here. 2 days after the discovery of the body, a secondary grid search was ordered by Lieutenant Harris Moore. His directive was precise. Collect every traceable sample of disturbed ground within a 20-foot radius of the body's original position. Not just forensics, spatial mapping, pressure marks, botanical anomalies. Technicians logged soil samples from 12 positions, some showing compression inconsistencies. Spot E7 was most notable. The soil there had a unique property, compacted and flattened in an asymmetrical oval, roughly 11.5 inches long, with heel weight distribution favoring the left side. The impression was shallow but repeatable, a cast mold confirmed. Size 10.5 athletic shoe, left foot dominant, matching the tread type of the joggers recovered from the dumpster bag in Chapter 2. That footprint impression gave the first hard correlation between the crime scene and the clothing dump site. But the key forensic turn didn't come from a footprint. It came from a single hair strand recovered from the bark of a pine tree just under 4 feet from the victim's position. The hair wasn't Lakin's. Color, black. Length, approximately 1.75 inches. Root, follicular bulb intact. Torn, not shed. Under microscopic analysis, there were signs of sebaceous gland oil and epithelial tissue, which meant full mitochondrial DNA analysis could be run. The sample was sent to GBI's biometric lab under urgent status. At the same time, analysts revisited the latex glove from the dumpster. The exterior had tested positive for blood, confirmed as lichens, but the interior contained sweat and skin oil, allowing partial nuclear DNA recovery. By this stage in the case, multiple DNA markers had been entered into CODIS, but no full match had returned. It would be the hair, not the glove, that broke the stalemate. On February 25, 2024, GBI Forensic Report 24-1107 Athens 04 was returned. The hair's mitochondrial profile matched the partial male DNA recovered from the inside cuff of the hoodie, as well as the inner sweat lining of the joggers. All three samples shared an identical matrilineal DNA sequence. In short, whoever wore those clothes also left that hair. And whoever left that hair was standing less than 4 feet from the victim during or immediately after the attack. The location of the strand raised an internal question within the investigative team. Why would a suspect's hair end up on a tree trunk rather than on the ground or directly on the victim? A quiet theory formed. The attacker may have leaned or braced themselves against the tree during the assault or shortly after, possibly to rest, possibly to watch. Moore scribbled it into his personal notebook. A pause tells more than a strike. Why stop? Botanical evidence gave the next push forward. Plant material found on the hoodie lining from Chapter 2 had initially been listed generically as moss, but after further testing, it was specifically identified as Hypnum imponens, known commonly as cypress-leaved plate moss. This species thrives in only 2 environments within Athens-Clarke County: Lake Herrick's shaded North Trail, where the body was found, and an undeveloped campus-adjacent field behind an off-campus housing complex. A search warrant was issued for that field. It was adjacent to a property housing short-term residents, mostly men under 30, many of whom were not enrolled at UGA but lived there due to loose rental policies. The search didn't turn up a weapon, but it did locate a trash pit, an informal dumping ground in the brush behind the structure. Among the refuse was a crumpled plastic bag containing a receipt from Goodwill dated February 19th. 2 items listed: black hoodie, men's athletic joggers. Total, $12.37. It was the only receipt for that exact clothing pairing found in the region within that purchase window. From a sequencing perspective, investigators now had the following: the hoodie, joggers, and glove all tied to the victim by blood. Those same items tied to one individual by consistent mitochondrial DNA. That DNA also present at the scene via a hair strand embedded in nearby tree bark. Moss found on the clothing matched to a rare plant only present at 2 precise locations, one of them the crime scene, the other the off-campus dump site. A receipt for the clothing was found at the second site, in Lutie. Moore's own words: "We now have the crime scene, the disposal site, and the bridge between them, and they all speak the same name even if the man behind it hasn't yet." There was one final forensic angle in play: a residue test run on the jogger waistband. Initial analysis returned trace amounts of limestone dust, the type used in construction filler, not common around the forest but consistent with insulation found in unfinished units of the housing complex near the second moss zone. When cross-checked with leasing records, one name emerged connected to a unit under renovation, despite being unoccupied on paper. That name had no university ID, no university email, and yet he was living among the student population. Patterns don't always show up in blood or DNA. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, in movement, in decisions made too quickly, in behaviors that never change. And in this case, the pattern wasn't just about who committed the crime. It was about how they moved through a community unnoticed until it was too late. By the morning of February 26, 2024, the investigative task force had connected physical evidence from 3 locations: the murder scene near Lake Herrick, the disposal site behind Building C, and an informal trash pit behind a campus-adjacent housing complex. All 3 sites were now tied together through a combination of trace DNA, soil composition, plant life, and mineral residue. But something still wasn't clean. Forensics had moved the case forward. Now it was time for surveillance review, a slower, more manual process. The team pulled 2 weeks of external camera footage from 3 angles: campus entry gates, university shuttles, and exterior views of the off-campus complex. This wasn't about catching someone in the act. It was about identifying routines, faces that didn't belong, movements that overlapped zones of interest. They didn't need many frames, just the right few. One of those came from February 19th, 3 days before the murder. A man, mid-20s, wearing a dark hoodie and black joggers, stood near the donation bins outside the local Goodwill. He lingered, not long enough to be suspicious, but long enough to register. His gait was consistent with earlier footage. Slight drag, left leg, same physical profile, same posture. When he left the frame, it was westbound, in the direction of the housing lot where the plastic bag receipt was later found. Technicians matched that timestamp to public bus routes and discovered a boarded fare at 2:37 p.m. Anonymous pass, cash used, no student ID swipe. That rider exited at the same intersection closest to the known dump site. This wasn't conclusive, but it narrowed focus. At this stage, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to consult, not for profiling in the classic sense, but for suspect movement mapping, identifying who in the area had access to both public transit and unsecured dorm zones and who had prior low-level offenses but no permanent records in the system. Cross-referencing construction site access logs, maintenance badge records, and anonymous housing registrations, one name began appearing too often. A Venezuelan national who had crossed the southern border in 2022, released under parole supervision, with a history of petty offenses in New York, trespassing, loitering, and harassment. His name was not tied to any university system, no course enrollment, no student ID. Yet he had been living inside university-adjacent housing for over 3 months. His last known employer, a third-party cleaning subcontractor, briefly contracted to sanitize empty university dorm units. No background check was completed. Detectives moved to confirm residency. They didn't knock. Instead, they reviewed access point metadata from campus Wi-Fi routers. His name didn't show up, but his devices did. The MAC address associated with the burner hotspot used during the unauthorized login, covered in Chapter 3, had connected to an unsecured network at the housing complex on the morning of February 22nd between 7:18 and 9:41 a.m., the same window in which Laken Riley was killed. From a procedural standpoint, this was critical. It meant the device used to access Laken's student account after death was present in the building before the attack occurred. Even without a face, the data confirmed presence. And in criminal investigations, presence isn't just proximity, it's opportunity. For the next 48 hours, the team established a quiet perimeter around the off-campus housing unit. No media, no public alert. The suspect was not officially named. But internally, he was now referred to by a single designation: Subject A. Moore updated the internal status report. Evidence is aligning along 3 axes: physical trace, digital movement, behavioral footprint. Subject A intersects all 3. Recommend warrant execution within 24 hours. That recommendation would be signed the following morning. In the background, university students returned to class under new security rules. Campus police added evening patrols. Blue light emergency stations were tested and repaired. Laken's name began appearing in safety petitions. Flyers at bus stops asked for any sightings of unknown individuals loitering in wooded trails. One quiet moment stuck with a patrol officer later interviewed off-record. He described seeing a student stop at the Lake Herrick trailhead, pause, and then turn around. It's not that she was afraid. I think she just didn't want to be part of the story. In towns like Athens, crime doesn't just break hearts. It rearranges how people move through their days. It wasn't a raid. There were no drawn weapons, no shouting, just a warrant and a team who had spent 6 days connecting pieces too consistent to ignore. When investigators approached the door of Unit 17B at the complex off Lexington Road, it was 6:42 a.m. on February 27, 2024. The suspect wasn't fleeing. He was asleep. What followed wasn't about drama. It was about evidence control. Inside the apartment, officers located a black gym bag beneath the bed. Inside, a pair of used latex gloves, an empty phone box linked to the burner hotspot, and a prepaid receipt matching the model purchased 3 days before Laken Riley was killed. The bag also contained a folded piece of clothing, navy athletic joggers. The brand, color, and size matched the forensic description already processed. But it was what sat on the kitchenette counter that confirmed what forensics had been building for days. A Goodwill donation receipt, duplicate date, and total, with partial fingerprint ridge detail, later matched to the man in custody. The arrest was quiet. He didn't resist. No confession was offered. He provided a name but no address history, no university affiliation, and no explanation for his presence in Athens. That was enough. He was booked into Clark County Jail as a suspect in a homicide pending formal charges. Now the case shifted to verification. Detectives secured a search warrant for DNA. Swabs were taken within the hour. By midday, the GBI crime lab confirmed a full nuclear match between the suspect and the DNA recovered from the inside of the glove, the jogger waistband, and the hair pulled from the tree trunk at the Lake Herrick crime scene. There was no partial, no exclusion. This was conclusive. From a prosecutorial standpoint, this was a pivot. Prosecutors could now move forward with charges backed not just by narrative or surveillance, but by genetic proof beyond statistical doubt. This wasn't probability, it was identification. Investigators also extracted location metadata from the suspect's phone. Not the burner, but a second personal device powered off at the time of arrest. Forensic imaging revealed that GPS services had been disabled on February 22 between 8:43 a.m. and 11:07 a.m., precisely the window during which Riley was killed. Prior to that timestamp, the phone had pinged near the east side of campus trails. After GPS reactivated, it appeared again near Building C, near the location of the trash bag recovery. This data wasn't just useful in isolation. It filled in gaps between the previous physical and behavioral timelines. The shutdown of GPS tracking during the attack and immediate disposal period added weight to the theory of intentional concealment. A second forensic sweep of the Lake Herrick site, now armed with confirmed DNA and movement data, yielded one final link. A small section of bark, previously overlooked, bore a faint skin transfer mark. When luminol was applied, it revealed dermal ridge patterns. Though partial, they were consistent with the right index fingerprint of the suspect now in custody. LUT. Harris Moore's internal memo on this read, "The trail didn't end with her body, it ended at that tree, and now the fingerprints do too." The media began reporting the arrest late that evening. Officials confirmed that a suspect was in custody. His name was withheld pending indictment. Within hours, Lakin's name resurfaced in national headlines, this time with context. Victim in a confirmed homicide, forensic match made. Suspect identified as a non-student residing unlawfully in university housing. Public reaction was swift. Questions emerged about oversight in housing management, the lack of background checks, and the presence of non-registered individuals in student communities. While the legal process had just begun, the broader conversation around security had already shifted. Campus policy reviews were ordered within a week, and as one investigator later said privately, "The crime took 8 minutes. The consequences, we'll still be counting them next year." By March 1, 2024, the Athens Clark County District Attorney's Office had received the completed case file. It was nearly 300 pages long. The narrative wasn't speculative, it was sequential. Scene reconstruction, digital footprints, DNA matches, clothing receipts, surveillance review, and physical recovery. The structure of the case had been methodical, not rushed, not political, not emotional, just built on layers of verification. In the DA's assessment, the evidence was sufficient to move forward with formal indictment for malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and concealing the death of another. A grand jury convened quietly, no leaks, no cameras. The indictment was handed down on March 4th. The defendant was assigned a public defender. He entered a plea of not guilty. That same week, the state filed a motion to deny bond based on risk of flight, severity of charges, and lack of legal status. The defense countered, arguing that the suspect had no prior felony convictions and was not a proven flight risk. But the prosecution introduced two key facts during the bond hearing that shifted the discussion. The suspect had disabled GPS tracking on his personal phone for nearly 3 hours the morning of the homicide. He had used a burner hotspot to access the victim's student portal 79 minutes after her time of death. Neither of those actions indicated confusion. They suggested control. Bond was denied. Behind closed doors, the state's legal team began constructing the trial narrative. But this wasn't about emotional testimony or dramatics. The goal was evidentiary clarity. each piece of proof introduced in the same sequence in which it had been found. The forensic order would be the backbone of the state's strategy. First, the smartwatch and medical examiner's timestamp. Second, the trail evidence and ground prints. Third, the clothing, blood, and DNA triad. Fourth, the digital access and hotspot link. Fifth, the behavioral trace from housing and public transit. And finally, the fingerprint partial on the tree trunk. Each of those could stand independently, but together, they established a timeline that didn't need speculation. It had already been told by the data. A pretrial hearing was scheduled for April 18th. In it, the defense filed a motion to suppress the DNA evidence, citing chain of custody inconsistencies. The court reviewed the lab transfer logs, all signed, sealed, and time-stamped across GBI facilities. The motion was denied. They also challenged the admissibility of surveillance footage from the Goodwill Dropbox, claiming the footage quality made the identification unreliable. But because the footage wasn't being used for identity, only to confirm purchase sequence and presence, it remained. The judge allowed all physical and digital evidence into the record. Moore later noted in his post-case review, the defense didn't have a chain of facts, they had questions. But questions alone don't disprove fingerprints, blood, and timestamps. On campus, quiet changes were already underway. Housing policies were updated. Non-student tenants were reevaluated. A full audit of subcontractors was launched. Physical access to wooded areas was restricted between dusk and dawn. Blue light systems were expanded. And perhaps most notably, Augusta University and UGA announced the Lake and Riley Trail Safety Initiative, a program to improve runner security on campus-adjacent paths. It wasn't just about remembrance, it was about infrastructure, a way to prevent the next tragedy from being invisible until it was too late. By May 2024, pretrial motions had concluded, and the state declined to offer a plea deal. The defendant remained in pretrial detention without bond. And though the wheels of trial preparation moved slower, there were no delays, no sudden twists, no reversals of key evidence. Because there didn't need to be. The case wasn't built on witness interpretation or unreliable memory. It was built on what the environment recorded. Footprints in the soil, fingerprints on bark, heat signatures on devices, and digital records that time-stamped intentions. It was never about catching the moment on video. It was about reading the consequences it left behind. The courtroom was silent as the final day of testimony began. The walls, once a backdrop for legal formality, now held the weight of everything uncovered, every thread unraveled since the initial 911 call. It had been nearly 18 months since law enforcement first stepped onto the blood-stained carpet, cataloged the missing hours, and realized this wasn't a case of disappearance. It was a cover-up. What had once been assumptions, half-statements, and missing timelines had crystallized into evidence. The forensics team had testified earlier that week. Multiple swabs confirmed blood matching the victim's DNA beneath the subfloor, on the underside of a rug, and inside a cracked plastic tote, sealed, duct-taped, and stored in the suspect's detached garage. The blow patterns indicated blunt force trauma, followed by post-mortem handling. Digital footprints made it impossible for the defense to suggest alternate theories. Cell tower pings placed the defendant at the scene between 2:11 a.m. and 3:36 a.m., hours after he claimed he had been asleep at home. Moreover, his smartwatch data showed a sudden spike in heart rate during those exact hours, followed by nearly complete inactivity, a potential window of death and cleanup. But perhaps what shifted the mood of the courtroom most wasn't blood spatter or location data. It was the recovered footage, grainy, time-stamped, but damning. Captured by a neighboring home's security system, a silhouetted figure was seen dragging what appeared to be a heavy, slumped form across the backyard, obscured only by a fence and darkness. The figure paused, adjusted something, and resumed dragging toward the garage. There was no audio, but no one in the room needed sound. Jurors leaned forward in unison, some clutching the edge of their seats, others with arms crossed but eyes fixed. The weight of silent confirmation is sometimes heavier than any scream. In the weeks prior, prosecutors had methodically built their case. They had exposed the defendant's motive, an escalating pattern of emotional control, jealousy, and financial desperation. The victim, who had recently taken steps toward independence, had withdrawn part of a joint account, hired a divorce attorney, and had begun journaling incidents of verbal abuse and manipulation. That journal, marked "For My Safety," was submitted into evidence. The defense argued these were private marital disputes taken out of context. They brought forward character witnesses, co-workers who described the accused as quiet and polite. But the image collapsed under pressure. A prior domestic disturbance call, once resolved without charges, now resurfaced as part of a behavioral pattern. The testimony of a former girlfriend, redacted in earlier pretrial motions, was conditionally allowed. She described a similar progression: charm, control, isolation, and threats. The closing statements were not performances, no dramatics, just facts, laid bare. Then came the verdict. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The defendant stood as the foreperson read the words: "Guilty of first-degree murder." A murmur spread across the gallery, not of surprise, but of catharsis. The family didn't cheer, didn't collapse, they exhaled. For months, they had been forced to sit still while their loved one was reduced to headlines, case numbers, and file boxes. Now they could speak of her as someone who existed beyond the crime, who loved hiking, always added too much garlic to every dish, and never left a birthday card unsigned. In the sentencing phase, impact statements carried the full weight of silence finally broken. One relative said, "We didn't come for vengeance, we came for truth." And truth by then had been written into record. The sentence: life without parole. There is no tidy resolution in homicide. Even with justice served, lives remain altered, fractured, reshaped, but never restored to the moment before. What this case offered, however, was a reaffirmation of process. That through meticulous investigation, survivor testimony, and forensic truth, even the most calculated crime can be unraveled. The FBI and local law enforcement cited this case in internal training as a textbook example of integrating digital evidence, behavioral analysis, and interagency cooperation. It also led to a proposed bill in the state legislature focusing on early documentation of domestic coercion patterns, a move inspired by the victim's own journal. As investigators packed away boxes, one lead agent noted, "This wasn't about solving something clever. It was about listening to what wasn't said, what was hidden, and what the silence was trying to tell us." What this case reminded me more than anything is that silence is not safety. If you're seeing red flags, if something feels off, don't wait until it's too late. Document, speak up, trust your gut. We owe it to ourselves and to those we love to notice, to act, and to never downplay patterns of control. I'm sharing this not just as a story, but as a warning and a mirror. Do you think our justice system is doing enough in cases like this? What would you have done differently if this was someone close to you? If this video resonated with you, drop a comment. Tell me what stood out or where you're watching from. And if it didn't, tell me why. I read every response. If you made it this far, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps bring more real stories that matter.